All right, guys. Welcome to a very special episode number 7 of the Rooster's Crow podcast. It's a very meaningful episode. I was able to have a conversation with Andrew McLuhan, who is the grandson of Marshall McLuhan and the son of Eric McLuhan. And I really appreciate his time and him opening up to a beautiful conversation that I hope you guys enjoy. We talked about, Andrew growing up as Marshall's grandson and as Eric's son, and what that was like. We talked about the work he's doing with the McLuhan Institute, which is very interesting and fascinating and timely and appropriate and needed. We talked about his course that he gave on understanding media, which is he did a deep dive, 30 hours on the first few chapters of this book, which he is going to be releasing as well, and he's doing another course. We talked about using the tools in understanding media to navigate the current media maelstrom that we're in, and how we can leverage McLuhan's insights to get a bearing on today's media landscape. We talked about technology and its effect on society and civilization. We talked about art. We talked about poetry and beauty. We talked about prayer, education, the Eucharist. We talked about parenting, and lots more. And we ended it on love and the importance of and what love is. So I hope you guys like it. I really enjoyed it. And I want to thank Andrew for spending some time with me. So I bring to you guys Andrew McLuhan. Thanks. All right, Andrew McLuhan, thank you, sir, for taking some time to chat with me today. Really appreciate it.
That's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. We were just talking before we started a little bit about your space there, and kind of I know you're getting into a new space, and if you can tell us a little bit about the symbols that we have in the background. I think that's something I've been interested in as I've been watching your YouTube videos, and tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, happy to. The space I'm in is what I refer to as the satellite McLuhan Institute. And that's a little bit of fun because, oh man, the difficulty with talking about these things is there's so many little side paths and digressions we can get off onto. And
let's just take them wherever it leads,
Sure. And the other thing is that a lot of McLuhan work is highly metaphorical and uses metaphor. So it's layers upon layers. It's very poetic, which works for me because I'm a poet, and can be fun for some and infuriating for others. If you don't like playing, with language especially, you're not going to have a very great McLuhan experience. But if you do like playing with language, if you do like playing and exploring and that sense of exploration and playfulness, then you can take McLuhan studies a long way. So the McLuhan Institute satellite is a bit of a play, and I have a logo for it. My good friend Dwayne King designed, which is my logo here, the bird, the pigeon, hanging off an image of Sputnik. Sputnik is relevant in McLuhan studies because Marshall McLuhan wrote that since Sputnik, the world has become a global theater in which there are no actors, only participants, that everybody is a participant in the global theater. And this is the switch from global village to global theater. And he marks the rise of Sputnik as the kind of delineation between the two ages. And he said with Sputnik in 1957, ecological thinking became inevitable. Mm-hmm. And what's really interesting, to me at least, is that Sputnik went up in October 1957, and less than a year later, in May 1958, Marshall McLuhan first said, "The medium is the message," which is an ecological statement.
Yeah.
And so, predicting his own, predicting after the fact, his own ecological view of technology and its effects. So back to the McLuhan satellite, when I first started the McLuhan Institute just over 3 years ago, I thought it would be a long time before I had a space which I could call the McLuhan Institute. And so I came up with the idea of satellite institutes or pop-up institutes where in a pre-pandemic or maybe post-pandemic world, I would travel to, say, Toronto or to New York or to LA or San Francisco with, a suitcase or two full of materials, and I could open up in a space and kind of preach the McLuhan gospel, as it were, and raise awareness about what I'm trying to do with the McLuhan Institute. So I put that to the test this summer. And I'm speaking to you from a place called Wellington, Ontario, and it's a small town. It's actually a village with a small population, 2.5 hours east of Toronto, that sees a lot of visitors in the summer. So I thought I'd try this idea of a pop-up McLuhan Institute here nearby, and I found this space, and it was very reasonably priced. So I set up some things for sale from our McLuhan bookshop with books and other things. And I kind of invited people to come in and discuss McLuhan studies and media studies and anything else. It was a lot of fun for me anyway, because as I said, I'm a poet, and I'm also a former, I used to be in a punk rock band, so I'm really into performance. So it was a lot of fun having people wander in and talk to them about McLuhan subjects. And I've kept the space this long because actually the realities of our world is there's a high-speed internet connection here. And where I live, we have a very poor internet connection. So in order to do Zoom interviews and things of that nature, I've kept this space basically solely for that. And because of that, I was able to teach a 3-month class on understanding media, which wrapped up in December. So, but I am getting ready to let go of the first McLuhan satellite. This is my last month here, and I'll be moving back to. Now I do have a dedicated McLuhan space because in the spring, while all this pandemic madness was touching off, my wife and I put our house on the market. Because my parents' place was going to go up for sale. My dad passed away coming up on 3 years now. And my parents had this small property, a couple acres in the countryside with a big barn and a small barn. And in the small barn is my dad's library, which is about 6,000 volumes strong, plus a lifetime of McLuhan memorabilia and artifacts and all kinds of things. It's a really precious and valuable collection, and basically it wouldn't fit in our house. So either we sold our house and tried to buy their place, or everything has to go somewhere else. And I wasn't really ready to see that happen. But the Lord and the world work in mysterious ways, and somebody bought our house, and they bought it for just enough to buy my parents' place. So now I live at the McLuhan Institute. And I'm working on getting a better internet connection. So instead of this echoey, empty, kind of sterile room, I'll be able to speak with you and everybody else from our archives, which I'm very much looking forward to.
Awesome. Excellent. That just seems so appropriate. That you're kind of in your space now. It seems that the coronavirus acted as a kind of a selective, put a lot of pressure on people to adapt quickly. And there's obviously a lot of negatives with it, but I think it's causing a necessary kick in the butt to get moving for all of us. And what came to mind, and I was watching previously your dad, Eric McLuhan's talk, his last talk, Media Ecology, and I watched it before, maybe months ago or a year ago, and I liked it. And I was like, man, it's very interesting. I watched it now, and it was one of the best McLuhan content video I've seen. I'm like, wow, everything he was hitting on was like, that's just happening now. And there was so much there. And it was right before we got on, and I'm like, I got to write this down. Actually, I was, taking a shower quickly, and I was listening to it. And I'm like, oh my God, I got to write that down. I'm like, I just got to absorb. So I got through most of it, maybe 45% of it, or 75% about it. But he says there, he has this quote where he says, he quotes McLuhan talking about Buckmaster Fuller, where he says, we're on spaceship Earth and there's no room for passengers anymore, only crew. So that reminded me of this idea that, we need to get to work and everybody is on Zoom now, and the increase in the use of technology is speeding up time. And I think Marshall, or in the medium and the light, he talks about how the light comes down, and the electronic age is just amplifying and accelerating all levels of human of being in the world, and we're seeing our institutions liquefy. We're seeing this decentralization, and it looks so negative if you view it through the lens of the old media channels that seem to be kind of holding on, to the old ways. And we keep viewing it through that lens. It keeps people depressed and anxious. But I think I'm hopeful, and conversations like this make me more hopeful. I just kind of get a good feeling. And then you mentioned something that you wanted to, spread the McLuhan gospel. What is the McLuhan gospel?
Well, I think it's hope, really. I think you said it right. And that's one of Marshall McLuhan's enduring things that he said was trying to get off this idea of hope. And what he was trying to do was, people might not realize, but he had goals. He was trying to accomplish specific things, and he went about it using all means available to him. And he was trying to wake up people, because, as he said, he isn't willing to just sit back and let the juggernaut roll over him. He felt that we were sort of the bystanders and willing victims of technological change, and we didn't have to be. If we want to, we can understand things before we put them out in the world. And instead of having to deal with side effects, we can design smarter our technologies for the world that we want to live in. And we haven't been doing
just to chime in there, so beautifully said. And I think your dad said it. The study, media studies, is the study of ignorance. And I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
wow. So yeah, can you maybe kind of riff a little bit on that? Because you're talking about, it seems like you're talking about how your grandfather was pointing to the water that we're swimming in, right? And you're now, taking the reins from your father. You are like moving it forward to actually, you're talking about building the systems that Marshall McLuhan was making us aware of, and your dad was making us aware of. So yeah, I don't mean to interrupt, but I just brought that up for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
It comes back again to this idea of ecology. Mm-hmm. And you brought up Eric's last speech given the night before he died, Media Ecology in the 21st Century. Yeah. Which is available on YouTube, and it's available in print if people want to see it, the text of it. And the idea of ecology, ecology isn't just study, it's action, and there's an obvious but useful parallel to be found in the natural ecological movement. It's really interesting to note that when Marshall published the Gutenberg Galaxy in 1962, Rachel Carson published The Silent Spring. And both were sort of ecological texts telling us that our environments are under assault by us, by the things that we create, and it's up to us to do something about it. For Rachel Carson's side, that spawned things like Greenpeace. On Marshall McLuhan's side, we haven't had the same ecological movement. I've asked a few times lately where the Greta Thunberg is of media ecology, because we need one. I think we're in a, it's one of the benefits of the insane speed of change these days is that we're starting to get an idea of the environment we live in, and speed makes that possible. When change happens very slowly, it's very difficult to notice it. Somebody asked if they raised the temperature of the bathwater by 0.5 degree an hour, you wouldn't know when to scream, right? Mm-hmm. But today, and especially since the last year, when things have gone really into hyperdrive, out of necessity, as people go online more and more and more, it's kind of funny. I think people at first thought they would have a lot of free time. And then everybody is saying, well, I'm busier than ever. Of course, but it is one of the marks of this speed of change that we're able to see a bit of this environment that we're in, which is helpful because if you know that you're in trouble, you can get out of it, but you can try to anyway. And Marshall liked to use as an allegory Edgar Allan Poe's story, The Descent into the Maelstrom. And in the story, there's a sailor who's out fishing, and where they are, there's this giant maelstrom in the water, like a huge vortex in the sea. And people know to stay away from it because you get sucked in and you're done. But he and his brother are out fishing, and they lose track of what they're doing. And before they know it, they're sucked into the maelstrom. And his brother, in his despair, jumps overboard. But the sailor, the mariner in Poe's story, has a bit of a cooler head, and because of the size of this thing, he's going around and around and down and down and down, and it takes a long time. And because of the way his mind works, he starts to look at what's happening around him, and he sees that some objects, instead of going down, are lifted up through the maelstrom. And he figures out how they do it, and he straps himself to a trunk, and he times it just right, and he jumps overboard into the maelstrom and is pulled up and out and is saved.
Wow.
And Marshall used this, Marshall got a lot from Edgar Allan Poe, but he used this story over and over as, again, a sign of this hope that we, there is no technological determinism if we're willing to study what's going on and do something about it. So that's why I say I think his overriding message is one of hope and of change through our own agency.
Wow, that was well said and timely. As it made me remind. I was having a conversation today. I was kind of looking for the quote, and this metaphor came to mind. And we were talking about the ambiguity and the vagueness that every event that we see on social media causes. Right. So we don't know whether or not Donald Trump was a Russian asset or not. We don't know whether or not the election fraud was real or not. We don't know whether the storming of the Capitol was an Antifa plant, whether it was Trump supporters going out of hand, or was it another psychological operation? You just don't know. And everybody gets channeled into, one perspective or the other, but the actual effect of it is this effect of a storm. And I posted this, or I replied, said they brought up this metaphor of finding the eye of the hurricane and moving as it moves till the energy of the storm is exhausted. And then also the story from the Gospel of Christ with his disciples, in a small boat being thrown to and fro by the waves. What was Christ doing at that time? He was sleeping, and his disciples woke him up, and he's like, "Oh, you ye of little faith." So this idea, it's amazing how you just brought it up like that. And I'm gonna have to look into that, the descent into the maelstrom, because it added something new. Because my question was, how can we take what Christ was teaching there to inform us how to navigate these ideological and social media maelstroms that we're in? So I wonder how that kind of it makes me think of taking the energy that's being created and channeling it purposefully, consciously into new ways of holding on and kind of persevering through and building the new, in a sense. So I that was very interesting that you brought that up like that. And he was intuiting what was happening, way before it was actually happening. So what are some insights from you and Eric and Marshall of how we can find that vortex?
Well, maelstrom escape strategies, right? Mm-hmm. How do we get out of the mess that we're in? And you can take an ecological approach to your own life, because let's face it, you and I are not in Silicon Valley designing the next social media, designing the next screen, designing whatever. So what can we do? There's a fun debate. There's a fun clip on YouTube. It's a debate with Marshall McLuhan, I believe Buckminster Fuller. I think he said Buckmaster, which is hilarious and amazing. It's Buckminster Fuller,
Yes, yes.
and W.H. Auden. And they're debating television. And Auden says, I don't have a television. I wouldn't dream of having one. To which Marshall replies, well, you simply suffer the consequences without enjoying any of the benefits, right? Because we live in a society which is very much controlled by screens, by these rectangles we're sitting in, by Zoom, by things like that. And you don't need to have a smartphone. You don't need to have a computer. You live in this society and you suffer the consequences, because everybody else does. But you can, to a certain extent, control your own ecology. And what I mean by that is that, we take it for granted now, but when Marshall McLuhan said things like the medium is the message back in the 50s, people thought he was crazy because they were very much a content-focused culture and society. We've grown a lot since then, and people can understand now that it doesn't, it's less important that you and I are having this particular discussion right now, but the fact that the world has existed on Zoom for the last 9 months. It's the aggregate. Another word for medium is environment. It's this environment of effects. It's the society that we now live in because of Zoom and because of the internet and smartphones that are the message more than the program, than the contents.
Yeah.
And the effects of technologies come in a few different ways. Marshall talked about them as the personal and the social, or the psychic and the social consequences of technologies. And what he means by that is that a technology like Zoom reorganizes society around it, but it also has personal consequences. The effects of sitting in front of a screen for hours and hours and hours and hours a day, the effects on your eyes, the effects on your senses, on your psychology, on your mental health, on your sensory lives, on your well-being. These tools shape us very personally. And what can you do about that? But the thing is, a tool like this has a much different shaping effect than a tool like this book, right? The printed word, and not reading an ebook. This is a book. It's a very big difference between light on and light through. Very big differences in terms of sensorial and neurological effects. So, we live in the society we live in. If we want to do a lot of our work, we have to use these tools, especially now when we can't socialize as much in person. But what we can do is mitigate those effects as much as possible. So, do your screen time if you have to, limit it as much as possible, and try to find a balance. And the way you can find a balance is, give your eyes a rest. If you're fortunate like me to live in the country or somewhere you can get outside and get in nature and be in the world. But another good thing is train your brain according to literature and the printed word, because as Marshall set out in the Gutenberg Galaxy, it was the printed word that gave birth to the Enlightenment, and not by accident. It's an effect of books and the printed word. So while we have few choices in the technologies that we have to use day to day, we also do have some choices. And so it's not hopeless, and you can do, do what you can. That's what I say. Read, write. I have a lot of fun writing on paper with pen and pencil. I got a typewritten letter in the mail a couple days ago, which was a first for me. I've never received a letter composed on a typewriter.
Hmm.
But the typewriter, the pen on paper, the thumb on screen, very different things, very different effects on you and on all of us.
Yeah.
I think I got a little sidetracked there, James.
No, not at all. Not at all. I think that was really good. And when you were talking about how Zoom, right, it's not this individual conversation that is what's not relevant or not aware, but more relevant is the way Zoom, like you said, is reorienting our personal being in the world, but also our social being in the world, because the need for cities and for highly competent people to amass in cities together to work together in order to build a company is no longer necessary. So we're seeing the mass exodus of people from cities because they can leverage these technologies in order to create companies and create new ways of working. And something that again stood out to me or came up for me was how your Marshall said that the future of work will be play, because we're only participating partially in the work that we do now. In the future, with automation, you'll be fully immersed in what you're doing, and it's going to be more like painting. And I was like, that really stood out to me. And I guess the question that comes up for me is, how can we think of art and poetry in this new media landscape that we're in? We can start with poetry. I'm interested in your thoughts on.
Yeah, well, Marshall he leaned heavily on art and the artist, and he spoke rather a lot on it. He liked to bring up Ezra Pound, who said the artist is the antennae of the race. He also got a lot from the work of Wyndham Lewis, who said that, not quoting verbatim, but the artist is the only one fully living in the present. The thing is, artists are the people in society who are always trying to look at things in new ways, right? They're constantly tuning their senses in order to explore and experience and then translate or tell us about it. That's why art often looks strange and uncomfortable, because the artist is out there on the frontiers of perception and reporting back to us. And it isn't until quite a while later that we catch up to it.
Mm-hmm.
Every generation thinks the new generation's music is awful and sounds terrible, but that quickly becomes oldies, right?
Yeah.
I'm listening to the radio station and they're playing like Nirvana and it's classic rock, and I'm like, are you kidding me?
Right. It's become classic rock now.
It was, the death of rock and roll when it came out. This is an example of arts and the artist on the frontiers of perception.
Let me chime in real quick, because funny you brought up Wyndham Lewis, and from reading The Medium and the Light, I was introduced to Wyndham Lewis. I bought his book Time and Western Man, and I did a few readings of it on YouTube, and I was literally the only YouTube video of talking about, except one British professor that did a thing on him. And then this man has been deleted from the internet almost on YouTube. There's nobody talking about his work. I bought the Childer Mass. I started reading it, and he's brilliant, like brilliant. He's a modernist painter. He painted a prolific painter. He was a World War I hero. He was a critique of what he called the time philosophy of Bergson, and this idea of favoring space and effacing time. I mean, favoring time and effacing space. And he wrote a lot about that. And I find him fascinating. And I find it even more fascinating that he's just, I've asked all of my, intellectual friends, philosophy friends, none of them have heard of him. And the quote that you brought up, and every time I interview someone, I bring up this quote, and it's, the artist is engaged in writing a detailed history of the future because he's only the one who can live in the present. And my question is, when things become calcified in society and civilization becomes too constrained, right? Art is used to break the constraint, and the role of the fool, right? The role of the artist to look what's on the edge and use that to revitalize the civilization that has become stale. What happens when the opposite happens, where it becomes too disintegrated becomes too decoherent. What is the role of the artist to bring coherence back? That question I don't really know the answer to, or I think the answer is emerging. Any thoughts on that?
Well, this is part of why Marshall said, if it works, it's obsolete.
Mm-hmm.
By the time it's familiar, it's the past. And this is, I have this, funny you bring it up, this is Wyndham Lewis's portrait of Marshall McLuhan.
Oh, wow.
Which I'm a big fan. Wyndham Lewis was one of the principal figures of early 20th century art movement called Vorticism.
Mm-hmm.
And the theme of the vortex, of the maelstrom, comes up a lot in McLuhan, right?
Wow. Yeah.
Marshall thought a lot of Wyndham Lewis, both as a painter and as an author. That Childermass trilogy, the Human Age trilogy, beginning with Childermass, is it's beyond me, frankly. I mean, I've read it, but it's a lot to go into.
It's like a hallucination. It's like a dream where you get pieces of it, and you're like, that's a lot of, and then you just have to, wade through the confusion to get the little nuggets. And it's like, it's funny how we're coming back to the vortex, and he was, and this brought up, he was kind of giving the same advice that you are giving. And the audience he was writing for unabashedly was people that read, people that look at literature, read literature, like find all of these avenues and connections that we have available to us now, and do the work, and he kind of gave the same advice to his reader that was reading Time and Western Man, which is just, he brings in from so many different philosophical and literature, these types of traditions. And I think I see that in Marshall, but I think we can intuit what advice they would give us now. And I think that's coming through you when you say, read, take a book and read, go look at nature, so kind of make sure you're including the real world into the virtual world, as we're working through the vortex here. So yeah, excellent stuff.
Well, because the thing is that, we know that our senses and our brains are to an extent plastic. Mm-hmm. They change. They're greatly formed by what we're doing in our early years, but they also change as we go on. Although the degree to which they do grows less and less and less as our senses, become more set in their ways and become duller over time. But that's why I urge for more engagement with the printed word and with the page, because I like to curate as much as possible my own media environment. And this course that I taught, October to December, end of December, was really great. It was partly an experiment because I ended up having somewhere near 40 students, which was amazing. And I encouraged them all. This is the book that we used. It was, I was teaching the first part of Understanding Media, which is 7 chapters. Plus I taught, we also looked at the 2 introductions that Marshall wrote, and a couple ancillary texts. We covered about this much of the book. Part 2 is another 26 chapters. Mm-hmm. So I was looking at the front part, and I encouraged my students to not download a PDF or the e-reader version or whatever, but to engage with the printed word, because I wanted to put this to the test and see, if we work with this text, and it was Saturday afternoons for 3 hours for 3 months, 12 weeks, would you notice any difference? It's all fine to talk about things, and talking about things is placing them in theory. But what happens if we put them into practice? Mm-hmm. Can we observe effects? And, Marshall was a very practical person. He was interested in effects, in what technologies do. Mm-hmm. He wasn't interested as much in theories. He mm-hmm. said, I'm perfectly willing to junk any of my ideas once they outlive their usefulness. And he was true to that, which you can see in his work. So for my own part, I read the book. every week. I made annotations in the margins. Any notes that I did pen or pencil. Actually, I did pencil on margins and pen on paper. I didn't do really any typing at all for those 12 weeks.
Wow.
And I found myself back in poetry. Between October and December, I wrote enough poetry to fill a book, and actually it's at the publishers right now, and is hopefully going to be coming out in the next month or two. Really, it's happened really quickly.
Yeah, that resonates. That just quickly, that resonates, and that just seems like, you get like a intuitive hits like that when you said that, and I know you posted it on Facebook. I'm like, wow, that just seems right, and that's very interesting. I have the book here as well. I cannot read books on on iPads or anything. I just can't do it. It's like I can't participate on Twitter. There's things that the algorithm or whatever it may be, it just doesn't draw me in. And I appreciate the book and I reading it, and I love the first few chapters. I got a question quickly. What surprised you about that course that you gave?
Oh, so many things surprised me. For one, it surprised me that so many people wanted to take it because, I threw it out on Twitter actually as kind of a dare. I'm not anti-academic, but I'm not an academic. I've only ever taught in universities. I've never taken a university course. I barely graduated high school, honestly. School was not something that interested me very much. But that said, a lot of my friends are academics and they're good people. Anyway, long story, but a lot of media studies courses, introduction to media studies, will teach understanding media or McLuhan theory. And it'll be, one unit inside a unit. So, a half hour inside one class. And I was just saying, it's impossible to teach a book like Understanding Media in one class. You'd need a semester to do it properly. And I threw that out on Twitter, kind of as a dare, I suppose, maybe to myself. And somebody called me on it and said, well, you should do that. And I thought, well, yeah, maybe I should. And okay, so I threw out another tweet and I said, if 5 people sign up, I'll write a syllabus, an outline, a course outline. And if 10 people actually sign up, I'll teach it. And like I said, I had about 40 students ended up signing up, which was, I honestly didn't think 10 people would sign up. And so I threw out that number to give myself an out so I wouldn't have to do it. And instead, people signed up. And I'm so glad they did, because it gave me the opportunity, the excuse even, to dive into this book in a way that I wouldn't have otherwise. So what I did was, I have a couple of copies of this that were Marshall's and Eric McLuhan's that they made notes in. Long story short, Understanding Media was basically a rewrite of something Marshall wrote in 1960 called The Report on the Project in Understanding New Media. And Marshall was hired by the NAEB, the National Association of Educational Broadcasters in Washington, D.C., to write a high school syllabus for Understanding Media, which he did, and he delivered this report. Part of it is actually in this 2003 edition of Understanding Media that you can read. And it's incredible. Marshall rewrote it for a popular quote-unquote audience, and that became Understanding Media, the Extensions of Man. Basically, Marshall took that report, which was for academics and bureaucrats, and he turned it into a large poem.
Really?
And poems are dense things which require a lot of unpacking. So what I was doing was I saw myself as a navigator. I grew up in this McLuhan world. Somehow I was born into it. I don't know how, but it happened, and I couldn't be happier to be here because it's a fun place to be. But by virtue of that, and I spent the last 10 years of my dad's life paying closer attention to what he was doing.
Mm-hmm.
But even before that, all my life, I'd been soaking in this McLuhan kind of brine. And basically what I did was I went through the book with my pencil, and I marked down, Marshall makes a lot of allusions to different works of literature, James Joyce, Finnegan's Wake, for example, also a lot of Shakespeare. He also brings a lot of phrases and a lot of fables like the Narcissus myth. This is a very densely packed text that once you start to pick it apart, it grows and grows and grows and grows. So
Mm-hmm.
I used my father's library, which I inherited, to go back to the books that Marshall references in here to find the different things he references. And I explained them, or rather, I led my students through all these different tunnels. And it just brought this text to life and helped you understand and read it in a very rich way. And it was just a pleasure for me because in my own life, I wouldn't be able to take, that time. Like I said, I spent 3 hours every week for 12 weeks, like this, talking to my students about it. And each week I'd come in with a stack of books of Marshall's and other people's, because when it came up, I would reference it. And it was really, weird. It went from the Bible and Francis Bacon and William Shakespeare to modern figures and to experimental dentistry devices and
Mm-hmm.
all kinds of interesting places, edible spaceships, weird stuff,
Yeah.
but very interesting. And at the end of it, the feedback I've gotten from my students was, it made me cry at sometimes because it was really, literally a life-changing experience for a lot of people. People wrote to me that it had changed their lives. And that's what it's all about, right? That's what you try, what any teacher, and I guess I'm a teacher now, tries to do is have that kind of an impact on their students' lives. And that was my hope going into this project, my own project in understanding media, was to see whether I could bring this book to life for people in the 21st century.
Mm-hmm. Something that just came into mind is I think Marshall had this quote, or maybe it's your dad. He said, "True communication is change, right? It is change, right?" And there's this idea in Orthodoxy called metanoia, which means metanoia, change of heart, right?
Exactly.
And I think, I put the question out there of what we can do to within the maelstrom, and I think it's coming through in you talking about you diving into the book to do a course. It wasn't your plan, but it was the environment that presented this opportunity to you. And in doing so, you connected with the book and connected with people. And I think if people see that and people do that, and I'm seeing different people on the internet. I know John David Ebert is connecting with Justin Murphy. I don't know if you know him, but he was a former academic, philosopher, theory-minded guy, and he left academia. And now he is putting together courses, like John is doing a deep dive on Jung, right? And people are flocking to these courses and people are reading the books. And so they're leveraging these new technologies to refocus on what made, the West and the world beautiful and amazing, right? And I think it's this process. And you're going to be, you recorded those and you're going to be sharing them, right? You said that you're going to be selling them or sharing them.
So it ended up being 3-hour lectures over 12 weeks. And with a bit of editing, it'll still be over 30 hours of content on, the first small part of the book.
You're going to do another one, right? Another course.
People want me to keep going through the rest of the book. So I'm going to do the second part in 2 installments, one in the spring and one in the fall. So I'm struggling to get that first part out so people can catch up if they want to take part in the other parts. That quote you brought up is from Theories of Communication, which my father, Eric, edited together of texts of himself and his father. And in the introduction, yeah, there you go.
Yep.
In the introduction, Eric says, it's a fundamental principle of this book that communication entails change. That change is the sine qua non of communication.
Yeah.
And that really encapsulates Marshall's approach to communication studies and what sets it apart from other approaches. Marshall would say that his is a transformation theory of communication, whereas the Shannon-Weaver model is concerned with transportation, with getting idea from one place to another and what happens along the way.
So is the root like communion, like to commune, to come together, really come together is what I think in relation with the other, is what causes the change, right? So is there a connection there, you think, with that commune and communication?
Yeah. And there's also communists, like the sensus communis.
Yeah.
The common sense. So common, the thing we have in common, communication, the thing we do together.
Yeah.
One of the things we looked at actually in UMI, it was called Understanding Media Intensive, was the chapter from Theories of Communication, Marshall McLuhan's theory of communication, the YEG, and YEGG. And YEG is an old term for a safecracker. And Marshall had likened his approach to that of a safecracker. He's there and he's turning the dial and listening for when the tumblers click, and that's his way in. It's very much perception based and observation. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to. I honestly wasn't expecting to do the rest of the book, but this wasn't UMI for me was an experiment. I've read the book a bunch of times, and it scared me to death to put myself in a leadership position because, like I said, I'm not an academic. I haven't formally studied anything. I just studied with my dad on a very informal and part-time basis. But I like to challenge myself because that's how we grow, and so I put it out there and I put myself on a limb, and I think it not only paid off for my students, but it proved to be a very rich experience for me. And a large part of it was about embodiment. Because so much of the time today, the more we engage with screens and these electric technologies, they're processes of disembodiment. They're taking ourselves out of our body and to A, B, C, and beyond. When you read a book, you're coming back closer to yourself. And that's a powerful thing, not just metaphorically, but quite literally in the literature,
Yeah.
And I was very gratified for that experience and that re-embodiment, which I think is something people crave more and more these days. I'm really looking forward to doing it again.
Yeah, that was excellent, and what just showed up for me was what was Christ's message was to have courage and lean into and another thought that came up is lean into the maelstrom, right? If you don't want to lean into it and kind of take a leadership role when the opportunity provides itself, and it seems like you've had all of this cultivation with your father through the time of his life, and it's your time is now. It's like the time has showed up for you and given the space for you to take the mantle. And I think you're in the very early stages of doing some beautiful things. And I'm glad to be up, to check it out with you.
The thing is, I think we're mutually in a boat that's been slowly descending this maelstrom. And as we get closer and as the funnel gets narrower, we're going faster and faster and faster. And if we don't jump off, if we don't time it right and jump off, we're done.
Yeah.
I don't mean to be doom and gloom about it. But it's time for us to do something. And I think people realize this. Again, the ecological difficulty we're in is a useful analogy because our technological environment is as much at a crisis point as our natural environment. They really map onto each other. It's subtler, but it's less and less subtle every day. And indeed, I think we're at a point where there is a certain public, and following from that might be a political will to do something about it. I think we're really close to being in a place where we'll start to take the reins a bit more. And my whole goal with the McLuhan Institute is to bring forward and make available the tools which Marshall and Eric McLuhan developed to help us study our circumstance and do something about it. Because again, coming back to this book, the first 7 chapters are really tools for which to look at technology. And why this book stands the test of time is because tools are timeless. If a tool is useful, then it's current. And that's what Marshall was trying to provide, was tools and techniques for understanding media, not just the past, but things that can bring forward. And so what I'm trying to do with the McLuhan Institute is pull out of McLuhan work these things which are useful today and tomorrow, and making them available and accessible. And the thing that I found, I thought that maybe a project I would undergo sometime in the future would be to rewrite understanding media for today's audience. And I discovered that understanding media doesn't need to be rewritten. People just need to learn how to encounter the text and how to use it. And those are very different things. And it's actually quite a relief because, who would I be to rewrite that? Instead, it looks like I'm publishing a book of poetry first, which I'm very thrilled about too.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. And what came up for me was the idea of, the flood and the ark, right? We need to build an ark because the flood is coming, obviously in the literal sense, from a scientific perspective, with global warming and climate change and the increasing in temperatures and the melting of the glaciers, right? Literally, that is a scientific metaphysics of the flood, right? And then also we see what's happening in the social media landscape and in our polluted information landscape, right? And the idea of sin in the Bible, the Greek word for sin is amartia, which means it comes from archery and it means to miss the mark. So if you miss the mark time after time as an individual, your life will lay out itself where you have disintegrating relationships. If you miss the mark as a collective, as a nation, as a global community, if you're missing the mark, right, you're going to have the flood. And the flood is a metaphor. It's also a symbol. But in order to, when you intuit the flood coming, you have pressure to build the ark. And the ark is not going to be, what we think of and read in the story, right? These are stories that are timeless, like the tools that you're talking about. And to build an ark is to build an apparatus, to build a community, to help build what is going to, help us find that jump off point into the vortex and then bring people along in a sense. So that's what kind of came up for me there. And I think it's very interesting that poetry is what's coming next, right? Poetry, in the beginning was the word, right? And this idea of logos. And when I think of poetry, I think of the logos speaking through the poet and something emerging, which is interested and interesting and beautiful. And when, like you said, that poetry is densely packed with meaning, where does that meaning come from? And how is its effect so powerful? And as I saw in a couple other talks that you gave, how poetry is kind of going away, and the interest in poetry is always from 50 years ago, which is a great thing. But with this new attraction to the work of Marshall McLuhan and to what you're doing, I think there's going to be more people And I think it's the generation that's coming, your kids and my kids, right? That's really going to be coming into the fold, that is going to, we're kind of helping bring the new, or help them cultivate our kids, to bring the new into the world, because I don't see a kind of another way out. So I guess in that same, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I think actually that poetry is more popular than ever, rather than the opposite.
Really?
Oh yeah. Poetry is huge on Instagram, actually, which is interesting.
Is it like new poetry? Because I'm not on Instagram. Is it like new people creating poetry?
Yeah.
Okay, wow, I'll have to check that
Yeah,
out. Yeah,
definitely.
interesting.
It requires a little thought to what exactly a poem is, and the difference, say, between poetry and prose. A poem is basically, a lot of information with the connecting matter pulled out and compressed into something that requires the person on the other end to decompress it and to add their own meaning, right? It's involving, and that's why it's a great forum today, because people want to be involved. Hip hop is the popular form of poetry today. Hip hop is very poetic. The language is highly metaphorical. It requires a lot of knowledge to understand it and to really get anything from it. And it's the same with what we traditionally think of as a poem. Poems require you to reflect and to consider the intent and the meaning, and what it might mean to you, as well as what it went into the writing of it. And that's what makes poetry so popular, is because it provides for the involvement of the end user, if you want to put it that way. Because a speech can be really boring. It doesn't give you anything to do but sit back and listen, and that can put you to sleep. But poetry, on the other hand, keeps you involved and engaged in completing the process behind meaning. That's why classes can be really boring, because the teacher's telling you everything and not leaving you anything to do. And so Marshall worked very hard to be more poetic. That's why a statement like "the medium is the message" is so powerful, because it's so open. There's so many different ways to take it, and even to dismiss it, you have to think about it. Which is fun.
And
So
Heidegger Heidegger thought that poetry was the closest to the logos, and before the new can emerge, the poets kind of intuit from where meaning comes from, or where the logos comes from, or whatever that is, right? It's the poets that bring the word down, right? And it's so densely packed, and then it's unpacked in the people that are experiencing and engaging with it. And I'm very encouraged to hear that so many people are into poetry on Instagram, right? Because that was the idea, that people are craving poetry, and I didn't even know that was happening now. So that's very it's very interesting. I'm going to have to check that out.
There were poetic influencers on Instagram, which is pretty funny.
See,
like Twitter is very poetic.
Yeah.
It's a very one of the hallmarks of poetry is constraint. Form. A form like a haiku is a very stringent, a very tight constraint. Twitter has a limit of characters, and that forces people to write a bit poetically. You'll find the language that people use is very poetic, in that it takes out a lot of the connective tissue and requires the person reading it to add that water to make it grow, to find the meaning. So I think poetry is far from dead. It's very much alive.
Yeah, no, excellent. I'm excited to see the book when it comes to fruition. So you think it's going to be published this year? You think this year it'll be published?
Yeah, it should be. It's coming out through Revelor Press in Washington. Are they Olympia? I think they're based out of Olympia, Washington. Okay. and it should be out. It's coming out really quickly, actually. It should be out in the next couple months.
Okay.
If I have my way, it'll be called Written Matter.
Okay.
So
Interesting.
look for that.
Excellent. What are your thoughts, and what were Marshall and your dad's perspective on prayer?
Well, Marshall, for people who don't know, Marshall McLuhan was a convert to Catholicism. And he says that he came to the church on his knees. He was a Christian before. He grew up in a Christian household, but his parents weren't picky on denomination. They would go to whichever church had the best speaker. Marshall's mother was a performer. She was an elocutionist, which was somebody who delivered dramatic monologues and poetry. She would do a play where she played all the parts, which you can imagine takes quite a lot of vocal skill, as well as memory and everything else. She taught the performing arts at the Pasadena Playhouse, which is where she met my grandmother, Corinne Lewis, and then introduced her to my grandfather, and the rest is history. But so they were interested in performance and in powerful speakers, and in studying that. Marshall converted to Catholicism by prayer. And the story goes that he was really fond of Chesterton, G.K. Chesterton, and he was going on and on about it to his students. And one of them said, well, if you like them so much, why aren't you Catholic? And Marshall found that he didn't have an answer. And he decided to put it to the test. And the way he put it to the test was through prayer. And he's, from what I've been told, and I don't know the details, but he prayed to God to show him sign. And apparently he received a lot of signs. And I don't know the nature of the signs he received, but I know that he received them strongly enough to convert to Catholicism in the 1930s. And that would remain throughout his life. He was a very devout Catholic. He famously went to church every day. That was more just a matter of convenience. Where he taught at the University of Toronto was right beside a Catholic church. So it was easy to go to noonday mass. If it hadn't been so convenient, he probably wouldn't have done it. He also read his Bible every day. He started off his day reading Bibles, but the interesting thing is that he had, and I know because I spent a long time inventorying his library, he had copies of the Bible in many different languages. And whenever he was traveling, he would grab the Gideon's Bible in whatever language it was available. He would ask the hotel if he could take it, and they always said yes, because that's what they're for. But the reason was, and he would start each day reading his Bibles in different languages. The reason for that was the Bible is a great control in that it's very consistent along translations, phonetically consistent along translations. So if you want to learn another language, a great way to do it is by reading the Bible in different languages. Marshall was always sharpening his perceptions, and each language carries with it different biases of cultures. Every language is a different way of seeing, of experiencing. The fact that the Inuit have, untold ways of describing snow, all the different things, all the things you can explain using one language that are lost in translation, show you how different cultures, different languages contain different ways of knowing, different ways of seeing, different ways of perceiving. Marshall's work was all about perception and looking at things in different ways. And so he was always looking for different ways to keep his perspective open. This is why he avoided the moral point of view. This is why he avoided saying that a given technology was good or bad. Because once you decide whether something is good or bad, you stop evaluating it quite so openly. So, Marshall was always looking for ways to keep his perspective as wide and as broad as possible. So,
Could I just chime
the
in real quick?
Bible,
Something that just
yeah,
came up for me is so the story of Adam and Eve, right? They ate from the knowledge of good and evil. They were to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and bad once they spiritually matured and after they ate from the tree of the tree of life, right? So the civilization is civilization as it's expressed and perceived through the knowledge of good and evil through the human intellect, which is itself fallen, right? We don't have the spiritual maturity to appropriately engage with the world and the environment because we're spiritually immature. So when it comes down to Marshall, just had this intuition to not put his inclination, his perspective of good and bad on the environment, and that he focused on that instead of the actual environment, I think is very powerful. And it just, it kind of hit me in a really, I think, interesting way right now of how, and the fact that he was a Catholic convert and his story with that and the piercing intellect that he had and the intuition that he had, and then bringing this up of how he, because it didn't click for me until you just said it there. Because I'm like, how can you not have a stance on whether something's good or bad? But that is the whole issue that got us in this predicament in the first place. So to take the mantle from him is to observe without using your limited fallen nature to make an observation, right? And it's ideas of ideology are coming up. Zizek wrote the book, The Sublime Object of Ideology, right? Ideology is idolatry, right? And if you just focus on, if you focus on anything that pops up in your awareness and you let that capture your consciousness, right? You keep getting sucked into the old, right? So I think just having this perspective of sharpening the tools of perception is focusing on the frame and the way that you are framing the world rather than what's happening in terms of the content. So you're not getting pulled into the content. You're stepping back and observing, from kind of a higher level of awareness in a sense. So yeah, that's just popped up with me. And do you know what, and maybe what do you think? And what did he think about the Eucharist or, eating from the blood and the body of Christ? Because I have some thoughts on that, but I wonder what he would think or what you think of that. What's happening there?
well, according to the Catholic tradition anyway, it's about transformation, right? The Catholics believe that, during the Mass, this Eucharist, this bread, actually becomes the body, the literal physical body of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And you could say this is another. You could use it by analogy to describe again Marshall's approach as being a transformation theory, as opposed to a transportation theory, which might be more Protestant.
Wow.
Because it's about change and it's about transformation. And that's what Marshall was concerned with. And so you can understand how the things are related to each other in his eyes. I think he said that with the Eucharist, it's the one example where the medium and the message are the same. They're
Mm-hmm.
one.
Yeah. What does that mean to you?
Well, it's this idea of transformation and reality, that there's no distance between, medium and message, that they are the very same thing. I don't know. I won't go very much further than that because I think it takes a lifetime and it's a very personal thing to try and sort out. I know for myself that's the case anyway.
Beautiful. Yeah, he said that Christ is the medium, right? I forgot how he said it. I think you just said it. That the only medium that's not mediated, the only environment, it's hard to even talk about it. Like the way you said it, the medium is the light. And he had,
well, it defies explanation.
Yeah, appropriately so, I think. Appropriately so. Wonderful. Any thoughts on what was the relationship you had with your father, Eric, and how does that inform how you are with your children?
Yeah, well, my father was the oldest of 6 children. He was born in the early 1940s, and his father was an English professor, and his mother was a Southern belle. She was a Texan. So he comes from a very conservative home, you know, very. And he was raised during a time and in a culture. And he was very much, I have this picture, and I treasure this image of Marshall and Eric. And Eric is maybe less than 10 years old, and Marshall's in a suit, and Eric's in like a little boy suit with the short pants and everything, and the jacket. And to me, my dad was really raised to be, the next Marshall McLuhan. And he tried to get away from it. He actually joined the Air Force and kind of moved away from home. He was he was born in St. Louis. He was an American citizen. And so rather than get drafted in Vietnam, he joined the Air Force, to sort of avoid the draft, not dodge it. But
Mm-hmm.
and I think he just wanted to live his own life and do his own thing. But he got into it anyway, and he ended up getting a bachelor's degree and then a master's and then a PhD. And he got kind of sucked into the McLuhan vortex, not in any negative or sinister way, but just because it's so damn compelling,
Mm-hmm.
and a little bit of understanding goes a long way. It is kind of addictive in its own way,
Mm-hmm.
I think when you find, I feel this in my own life. So, growing up, I'm really grateful to my dad and to my mom because I was raised to find my own way very much. I know that my dad would have loved nothing more than for me to go to school. And he made it plain that they wanted me to go to university and everything, but they always pushed me to discover what I wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt that very strongly. But I also know that, in my teenage years, I kind of rebelled against the whole thing. And when somebody asked me, what the meaning is, the message meant, I just flipped them the bird.
Mm-hmm.
Read a book. Why are you asking me? I didn't write it. But I got interested, and so I tried to read Understanding Media, and it just went way over my head. So forget it. And in my 20s, I tried again, and it made a little more sense, but still not quite that much. And then in my 30s, I started working with my dad, and I took on this project of inventorying and cataloging Marshall McLuhan's library. And I started traveling with my dad when he went on speaking engagements because he was a diabetic and he'd sometimes have problems, and you needed somebody there who knew what to do. And one time my mom didn't want to go to Poland, so I went instead. And I guess, just enough time had passed and my mind had matured enough that it clicked,
Mm-hmm.
and I understood maybe for the first time really what some of this actually meant. And that is nothing is quite so delicious as an epiphany.
Mm-hmm.
And you might not be able to explain it to anybody else, but you're done for. You're ruined,
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
over. And I found myself drawn into the work, and especially inventorying my grandfather's books is a strange thing, but his heavily annotated library contains so much of him.
Mm-hmm.
He's really present there, and I got to know him. He died when I was just 2 and a bit years old, and pardon me, I got to know him through his books, through his library, in a very personal way that I wasn't expecting.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of got drawn into it without meaning to, or without really wanting to. And my dad had the same thing. Although, again, he went the academic route and was very much a scholar, like in the most impressive meaning of the term. Like he wrote this book, Media and Formal Cause, which is a collection of his and Marshall's essays on this topic of formal cause, one of the four parts of Aristotelian causality. Efficient, material, final, and formal. There you go. So in order to do that, this essay, which is really the crown of that, on formal cause, in order to write that, he taught himself or relearned Greek so that he could go back to Aristotle and other works in Greek in the original language to meet them on their own terms. And that to me is the epitome of a scholar, you know, that kind of dedication to really getting at a thing's roots. That to me is what a scholar is. And I'm not a scholar, you know, but I can recognize and respect that. So I come at this whole thing from a different approach. I think media studies, McLuhan studies certainly have been in the academy for a long time. And a lot of papers have been written, a lot of conferences have been had, but not a lot has been done. And we're at a time when things need to be done. It's, you know, our societies are paying the price for our technologies. And I think we're the ones who have to do something about it if anything's going to be done. So I operate outside of academia. I'm extra academic, not anti-academic. I just, I think we need to work in the world and meet things on their own terms in situ. So that's what this is all about, by the way, this symbol here. And I know you're into symbols, but when I was trying to think of a logo to stand for the McLuhan Institute, I came back to something that Marshall said a few times. He called himself a Winnipigeon. And he was describing himself as being from Winnipeg, Winnipeg, Manitoba. And he called himself a Winnipigeon, as in Winnipeg. Now, this is not a thing. Other Winnipeggers don't call themselves Winnipigeons, as far as I know. But he did, and I love the image of it. Marshall was a very, again, with the poetry, he was very imagistic in his words. There's a majesty in the image. And that term Winnipigeon is very evocative. So, you know, I imagined it as a pigeon sitting on top of a W for Winnipeg, right? Winnipigeon. So then for the McLuhan Institute, I thought about what I'm trying to do. And really I'm trying to come at it from a whole other point, a different approach, which is a little bit irreverent, you know, like I said, kind of giving the finger to the whole thing. So I flipped the bird, as it were, and now it's a pigeon hanging from an M for McLuhan, or for the McLuhan Institute. So this is how I represent the McLuhan Institute as doing things differently, as a different perspective. And again, you know, to use the English phrase, kind of flipping the bird at the whole thing.
Wow, that's beautiful. You know, this whole idea of, you know, just quickly what came up for me is this prodigal son motif that seems like, I think it's part of the structure of reality, these stories, these timeless tools. I think you can think of them, you know, I don't know why I keep coming to the Bible here, but the prodigal son, like your dad tried to get away, or, you know, had this leaving and then coming back, you know, situation, and you had the same thing, right? And when you came back, it seems that something has to change. There needs to be something has to be done. And the idea of the person that, you know, flips, you know, the flip is to, when things become too out of hand, like the whole yin yang symbol, right? Chaos happens and then order is the flip, you know, so flipping the bird and then you flipping that logo makes me think, you know, it's just, you know, working through you like that. And I think it's a very beautiful thing, man. It's very cool. And, you know, what you do, I don't know if you still do it, but you restore old furniture and you share pictures of that on Facebook.
Yeah.
And I think it's so appropriate, right? Restoring old furniture. It's like what your calling is manifesting on different levels, right? And the physical level, when you're in restoring furniture, beautiful old furniture. You're taking pictures and sharing of trees at different times of the season, and you get a sense of what I get a sense of what you're looking at when I see the pictures, and I'm like, wow, that's beautiful, and I love that, and what you're doing with the institute, I think, is this kind of same revivification, and this category, or this catalog of books, the 6,000 books of Marshall's. I mean, I can't even symbolically frame how what that means in a sense. Would you have a resource there, not just in terms of in terms of regular books? What you have is the identity of your family, and it's in your hands. I would, I would love to see like a tour of that. I know you kind of do some writing and some work in there, but I'd love to see a tour of those books. It's a very beautiful thing, and um, there's a lot of different things that
I'll
different ways.
actually be talking.
I'm sorry.
I'll be talking about it again next Monday. I'm doing a talk for an institute in Frankfurt, Germany, about Marshall McLuhan's library, and I'll be doing it from Eric McLuhan's library,
Wow.
which I've been spending, now that I live there in the library, I've been spending a lot of time actually cataloging and inventorying and exploring Eric's library, much the same way I did Marshall's. Marshall's library, his books are now at the Fisher Rare Book Library at the University of Toronto.
Hmm.
And I own Eric McLuhan's library, which is very similar in size and in scope. It's an annotated working library. Again, these are tools, and there's almost a separate discussion to even really get into that. But it's almost a magical thing, these libraries. To go in there is to enter a universe of its own, and it serves things up. It's you take your day into your hands if you dare pull a book off a shelf or open a cabinet and pull a file and take a look through it, because before you know it, it's 2 hours later,
Yeah.
or a day later. Eric's library sits in a 2-story barn, and the bottom floor is the library and archive, and upstairs I'm planning on building a suite with a small kitchen and bathroom and living quarters for people to come visit, to spend time researching and be in that area to do research and writing and artwork. And I hope perhaps you and your family can come up for a visit sometime when things are possible again. But upholstery, which is my side business there, it's the same approach I take in upholstery as I do in McLuhan studies, and that's the practical approach. There isn't, when you're reupholstering a chair, there isn't a lot of room for theory. It's what works, and use the tools at your disposal. And if you don't have the tool, you make one. If you have a method that doesn't quite work, you figure out a way to make it work better, more efficiently. To do and that's the same approach I take to McLuhan studies. I'm surrounded by tools, and I have a job to do, and you pick the right tools for the job.
I like how this whole idea of you choosing the tools instead of the tools choosing you, right? It's like kind of taking the reins again from us being kind of mindlessly carried by this momentum of technology. How can we think of McLuhan insights, these insights that you bring, to the upholstery, to the work that you're doing with the Institute? How can we bring this to parenting?
Sorry, how can we bring it to what?
How can we bring the insights in how we raise our children and in parenting? Because how you were talking about, if you don't have a tool, you create one, and you kind of create an environment and cultivation for the experience of using tools instead of them using you. How do you think about that in terms of parenting?
Yeah, the parenting gig is hard, as I know you know. There's kids aren't kids. Each one is different, and you can't treat them all as the same thing, because you can't really, raising children is all on the job training, and
Mm-hmm.
everybody's got advice for you. And most of it isn't useful except in an abstract way, because
Mm-hmm.
every child is different. But some things do hold in common. We want our children to be loved, so we have to show them love, and we have to show them what love looks like.
Mm-hmm.
We want our children to be smart, to be intelligent, to be curious, so we have to encourage them to be curious. We have to allow them to become these things. And the best thing we can do, I feel, is to understand the effects of technologies,
Mm-hmm.
and to it's a huge, it's the biggest responsibility, raising a
Mm-hmm.
child, because we need more people in the world that care and are conscious and considerate, and it's up to us as parents to do that. There's really an incredible amount of power in our hands,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm not sure people give that the respect it deserves. Um, Listen, I don't shield, I don't completely cut my kids off from technologies. Mind you, I also have a broad understanding of what technology is.
Mm-hmm.
When I say technology, I don't just mean screen devices. I limit their screen time as much as possible, because I know, these young kids, and mine are 4 and 6 years old. My boys, Ezra and Virgil, they're very young, and their brains are sponges. And the things that we put in front of them now set them up for a lifetime of sensibility.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so we discourage screen time as much as possible. We encourage play and exploration, um, play with language. I love that my kids are punsters.
Mm-hmm.
They've been making puns and jokes and everything since they were very young, and they're very much McLuhan kids, which is great. Drives my
Mm-hmm.
wife a bit crazy. They're also readers. They're big readers, and
Mm-hmm.
I love that, because the brain that is raised on books is the brain that's raised to go slowly and to consider and to use reason, and uh, and the product of that is going to be different than the product of the kid who's just sat down in front of a screen and allowed the screen free reign.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen what happens with that, and it's not the greatest outcome. So, but I can only speak to myself as a parent, and parenting is a tough gig. Uh, so it's not for me to say what anybody else is doing is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
You got to follow your heart, and it's hard because you're pulled, as a parent, you're pulled in so many directions. But we just do the best that we can, um, and hope for the best. Hope.
Yeah, hope comes in again, and I think what just came up for me is how you said, if you want to show your kids love, you got to show them. You have to, they don't pay attention to what you say as much as they pay attention to what you do, and this idea of you are what you care about came through, right? So like it's like this idea of Heidegger talked about human beings, our fundamental mode of being in the world is care, is concern. What does that mean? Well, what you care about, you become, and our society seems to have taught us that we should care about reputation. We should care about wealth in terms of financial wealth. We should care about, doing well in business, like in spite of everything else. And I think there's this shift that has to happen to move our perspective back into the home, right? We had this whole wonderful thing of women's liberation, which is a wonderful, beautiful thing that we have opportunities for women if they want to go into the corporate world and not be ostracized or looked at different. And we're not good or perfect at it, but that's a beautiful thing. But what's happened is we stopped focusing on the home, right? And we've seen this proliferation and disintegration of the family. And what I'm seeing in a lot of these different corners of the internet that I explore, and I see that you're interested too. A lot of people are talking about parenting, and they're not talking it in a sense of, you need to do this, you need to have a schedule, you need to have this. It's about showing them love, right? Love is how you grow kids,
Yeah.
like attention, right? Consciousness, playing and being with them without doing it while doing everything else, right? And just spending time, and attention and consciousness is what grows kids. Love grows human beings. And I think that's what kind of came through when you were talking there. And what are your thoughts in terms of, children and education in the school system? Is this something that we need to mitigate with our home schooling, or with, what do you think about the educational system in terms of our kids? Because it seems to be archaic. It hasn't met these new challenges, and what do you think on that?
Well, it is. Our education systems are hopelessly outdated. They're based on principles and technologies and ideas that we left behind a long time ago. There's that's nothing new.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's incumbent on parents to really give really a lot of education to the children. You can't count on the school system to educate your child in a very completely, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I love teachers. Honestly, my kids' teachers are very caring, and they do the best they can within a system which has its own constraints. For me, I have very definite ideas on what's good and not good for my child.
Mm-hmm.
And currently, Ontario, where I live, is in lockdown because of the pandemic. And Christmas break, New Year's break is over, and the kids should be in school, but the schools are closed. And the government of Ontario has mandated 225 minutes a day of synchronous online teaching. They want my kid, my 6-year-old child, to sit in front of a screen for 4 hours. And if you go online and you look at what health agencies recommend in terms of screen time, none of them say more than an hour is good for your kids. And even then, they qualify it and they say quality content, as if that makes a difference. Of course, we know that it doesn't make very much of a difference. Content is content.
Mm-hmm.
Screen is a screen, no matter what's on it. But so, it's a struggle. But all I do is I actually, I turn the screen off as much as I can, and they can just listen, and that's much better.
Mm-hmm.
And thankfully, my kids don't have any large learning difficulties that we've identified, and they love reading and looking at books. So we just pour that on as much as we can. Whatever subject they're interested in, we get them as much reading material as they can. And we do what we can. And I think it's up to us, again, as parents, to do the best that we can. But like we both said, really, love counts for so much.
Mm-hmm.
And teach them how to love and how to be loved, and they will be loving people. And I think that's the best thing we can do as parents, is bring loving people into the world.
Completely agree. And this brought up for me, I was having a conversation of this book club, this book review for the book Language of Creation by Matthew Pajot. And we were talking about what is higher in the hierarchy, and not higher. We didn't really get to parse what we mean by higher. Is it truth or love? What's higher, truth or love? And some people were saying truth, and the idea is, I think it's love. Right? I think love is the highest, right? And they got into these practical discussions of the coronavirus and the measures and the effects that it's having by using these scientific tools and these scientific statistical analysis to make certain decisions. And it got real because my wife, she's an ICU nurse. She works here. We're here in Florida, so we have high number of COVID patients. Not that many in the ICU as we did a few months ago, but they still have this policy, and that you cannot have anybody come and visit a COVID patient. She had this 59-year-old patient who, he was sick, but he wasn't that sick, and he had the coronavirus. And then, he started declining. And one day she comes in and he says, oh, I don't feel well today. I don't feel good. Like he knew he was going, right? And he wanted to, his family couldn't come see him, his kids, right? And he was on his last legs. Like you can tell when somebody's about to go. So his phone was dead, and my wife was like, "You're getting an iPad, like, because you can look at them and you can, engage with them through technology and an iPad." And she brought him an iPad, and she said she was talking with the kids, and the kids were like, "Oh, you're gonna make it through this, Dad," and they couldn't be with their father as he's dying, and we both thought to ourselves, there are things worse than death, in this. It might be the case that if you allow a family member to come in, statistically, it increases the probability that the coronavirus might spread more, right? But so there's no love included in these measures at all. It's just complete, and it's completely a destructive force on what's happening. And I think that this coronavirus is again having, like from an evolutionary perspective, selective pressures on all institutions, education, corporation, Hollywood, media, the medical community, the way that we produce our food, transportation, money, the decentralization of currency. In terms of coronavirus, my son has to wear a mask when he goes to school, right? And it's receded into the background. It went from being an issue to being normalized. And we're seeing a lot of this happening in different reads. So you see how the environment recedes into the background. And it made me think of, what are your thoughts of, I'm not against masks at all. I think if worn appropriately and the science is followed, and it's going to help. But if it's not, and you're wearing like a sock or whatnot, it's just, if you look at the actual literature, that's neither here nor there. What is the technology of the mask? I look at it as an externalized portion of our immune system, just like media is the extensions of our sensibilities. So we're trying to, force these measures on an outcome and a consequence of our decision making, like the spread of the coronavirus, and it's probably its outcome and its origin were from sin, right? Missing the mark, studying a bat coronavirus in order to do gain of function testing, right? In order to, for whatever reason, that's not the right thing to do. Like, and you can tell because of the outcomes and the consequences. How can we think of these coronavirus measures and the mask being worn on healthy people for months or maybe years at a time? How can we think of that in terms of, the medium is the message? What is the message through these medical measures that we're all getting?
You ask such simple questions.
Yeah, I know.
The mask is an interesting thing. It's Marshall spoke about masks quite a bit. He liked to bring up Baudelaire, who said, "Hypocrite lecteur, mon semblable, mon frère," the mask reading wearer, the hypocrite lecteur. Because a hypocrite is the word means someone who wears a mask.
Wow.
The whole mask thing is an interesting phenomena. It's almost the literalization of something we all understand metaphorically, how we all wear various masks. It's been an interesting thing. Like you said, kids, it's amazing how quickly they adapt. Our children as well. When schools reopened, it was they have to wear masks. And it's a little funny because our youngest, the 4-year-old Virgil, he has very kind of floppy ears, so to put a mask on, it wants to come off. It's hard to keep a mask on, but it quickly went into something that's just, well, you just wear a mask all day, and they come home and they get off a bus and they don't even know they're wearing it anymore, and there's a lot of metaphorical mileage there.
Yeah.
It's interesting, the question you posed at the very beginning about which is higher, truth or love. And I think it's a false binary, because I don't think there is a difference. Love is truth. Love is the ultimate truth. I think anytime you're missing love, you're dealing with deception and illusion. Whereas when you're dealing with love, you're dealing with truth.
So what do we do with in terms of our materialist scientific perspective and in our experiments and the way that we do science? Love is not in the formula. Do you think is there a way to Do you think that's going to change, or is there a way for that to change? Because I think science embedded in this broader understanding of the world it makes it a wonderful tool to advance society. But when it becomes the tool, it becomes like the religion, like science with a capital C. Um, that's we can get really into some,
Yeah,
what's happening with AI and whatnot. How do we incorporate love into science?
well, that's a very good question,
Yeah.
and it's something we seriously have to consider. And I think it might be a big missing part of the formula here,
Mm-hmm.
because science, in all its manifestations, has a lot of uses. Um, it's a great tool for a lot of jobs, but if you take love, if you take love away, very little lasting and good can come. You know, I think you're quite right that. In fact, that's a very interesting point. How do you put love into this equation? And it's when we take it out of the equation or leave it out that we get into a lot of trouble.
Mm-hmm.
And most of our technologies, certainly screen-based things and apps, are not designed with any kind of love involved. Even dating apps, interestingly enough, are not designed with love involved. They're designed with engagement involved. And you can put a love emoticon on it, but it's not love. You're trying to capture people's attention, and that's not the same as capturing or giving or providing for love. And thank you. Actually, that's very, very good food for thought, James. Because I think love is the answer to so many of our questions.
Yeah, that I've never thought of that. Like that just emerged here in our discussion, and I think education, right? How do we incorporate love into education? And then
the Beatles said all you need is love, and I don't
Mhm.
think that's right.
Mhm.
We need more than love, but we need love.
You absolutely need love.
Can't do without.
Yeah, that's central. What do you? I don't even know if that's the right
Jamie,
question.
I,
Yeah.
I hate to do it, but I've got to get going. It's like 3:00.
Oh man, yeah, you're right. Actually, I took you about half hour longer than you committed to. So yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, we can wrap it up here. There's a lot of different, I think, food for thoughts we can take back. I really enjoyed this conversation. And maybe the last thing, I saw that when you talked to John and Michael Aaron Keemans, you talked about reading Finnegan's Wake, and that Marshall and Eric read that together to each other. So I'll put it out there. I've never read the book. If you wanted to do a series on YouTube, reading it to each other, let's do it.
Oh, that would be fun.
Yeah.
I'd love to do that. I wish I'd done it more with my dad.
Mm-hmm.
We only really on one occasion sat down and read Finnegan's Wake together, and I wish we'd done it more, because it's a fun thing. It can also be very uncomfortable because you have to be okay with making a bit of a fool of yourself. But I'd love to do that sometimes. Let's do that, James.
Yeah, and I've never read it, so excellent, man.
Get a copy.
I did actually got one because how it affected Marshall. I got a hard copy here, but I'll let you go. I know we went over time here, but I really appreciate it connecting with you. I think it was a great conversation, and hope we can do it again sometime. Much love to you, sir.
You too, James. Thank you.
All right. Yep. God bless.
All right. Talk to you later.